セッション2はスペシャルセッションといたしまして、アフリカのエイズとジェンダーというテーマでお届けしてまいりたいと思います。ただいま舞台上のセッティングをしておりますので、今しばらくお待ちくださいませ。それでは参りましょう。スペシャルセッションです。アフリカのエイズとジェンダーでお届けしてまいります。ご登壇されるお二方をご紹介いたします。南アフリカエイズ研究プログラムセンター次長、国連合同エイズ計画 UN エイズ思春期 HIV 特別大使で、昨年第4回野口英世アフリカ賞を受賞されましたカライシャ・アブドゥル・カリム先生です。どうぞ壇上にお願いいたします。そして聞き手は AK 大学准教授、グローバルファンド技術審査委員、人権とジェンダー瀬古素子さんです。ここからのお時間は瀬古さんにマイクをお預けしたいと思います。では瀬古さん、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
ありがとうございます。ご紹介に預かりました、AK 大学、広島の県立大学の大学なんですけれども、そちらで、教鞭をとっております瀬古と申します。私は20年ほどですね、国際協力の世界、特に、HIV エイズ対策、それからジェンダーといったところのグローバルヘルスの分野でアフリカ、アジアを転々とした挙句になぜか広島にたどり着いたという人間です。本日はですね、このスペシャルセッションで素晴らしいお客様を招いているということで、広島から飛んでまいりました。多分皆様よりも私が一番今日緊張もしていますけれどもエキサイテッドだと思います。私たちジェンダーに関わる人間が、ジェンダーと HIV エイズに関わる人間がとにかくこの発見を待っていたという、研究をたくさんなさったドクタープロフェッサーカライシャ・アブドゥル・カリムをお迎えできることを非常に嬉しく思っております。一応なんですけれども、少し我々がこれからお話しするにあたってですね、皆様のご協力を得て、皆様がどういった方なのかをちょっとお伺いしたいと思います。アフリカに知見がある、行ったことがある、エイズというものを知っているという方、どのぐらいいらっしゃいますでしょうか。意外と多い。So Dr. Karim, we have quite a good audience who knows about Africa. That's wonderful to go. では、この後、先ほどまではHIV エイズ、特にニューヨークゲイコミュニティという場所の、設定の話をしておられました。私もたくさんの先達の、研究者だったり制作者だったりという方々、ゲイでニューヨーク出身という方たちをたくさん仲間に持っておりまして、その人たちのやってきたことを継承しなきゃなと思って、伺っておりましたが、ここからは皆様をアフリカにお連れさせていただきたいと思います。で、セッション2ですけれども、ごめんなさい、ドクターカライシャをご紹介させていただくのは日本語でさせていただきます。本日ドクターカライシャ、プロフェッサーカライシャ・アブドゥル・カリム、ご参加いただいておりますけれども、皆様ご承知の通り、南アフリカエイズ研究プログラムセンターカプリサを、パートナーのドクターサリムとともに創立されて、主に南アフリカでの HIV エイズ予防、治療にかかる数々の画期的な医療的研究を行ってこられました。エイズ発症を抑えるための薬ですね、抗レトロウイルス剤を使った、暴露前予防薬、プレップと申します。実は日本でもまだ使われていない、医療技術なんですけれども、その予防のプレップの基礎を証明されて、2010年以降の、世界での HIV 予防というものをですね、大幅に変えた、いわゆる世界的なゲームチェンジャーです。ドクターカライシャの功績をすべて挙げると、この時間の半分ぐらいかかりますので、ここで簡単に、 割愛させていただきますけれども、世界のさまざまな国で多くの賞を受賞されており、また昨年の第4回野口英世アフリカ賞の受賞も記憶に新しいところだと思います。現在もカプリサの次長として研究を継続されながら、国連合同エイズ計画 UNAIDS の思春期 HIV 特別大使を務められております。感染症疫学者として、それから HIV エイズと共に生きる人々、感染リスクが高い人々、若い女性女児を感染から守るために、ドクター・サリムと共に大変なご活躍を続けておられます。ではここから私も英語に切り替えます。同時通訳をご利用の方、ぜひイヤホンのご用意をお願いいたします。Dr. Karaisha, it was a long pre-talk talk that I had to give because your series of contribution to the global AIDS epidemic is so huge and so long. Would it be possible for you to give us a brief explanation of the current situation of HIV/AIDS epidemic and how the responses have been in Africa to take us through?
Thank you very much, Dr. Seko, and greetings to all of you. It's a real honor and privilege to be part of this pre-World Day activity, World AIDS Day activities, and especially being in Japan. And I particularly want to pay tribute to the people of Japan and the government for their commitment to the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria, for their partnerships and collaborations in terms of advancing our efforts to respond to the HIV epidemic globally. But to come back to answer your question, Dr. Seko, what is the situation right now? And I think in the opening session, you heard all of the speakers talk about where we are with HIV, the most recent data in 2022. And I want to do like a very quick reminder. In 2016, at a high-level political meeting in New York, where member states committed to ending AIDS as a public health threat by 2030. And why that was possible and what happened at that moment was a confluence of knowledge that we could actually set this target for 2030 to end AIDS as a public health threat. And what were the goals that were defined that member states committed to? And that was by 2030, we will have 0 new HIV infections, 0 AIDS-related deaths, and 0 stigma and discrimination. And UNAIDS at that stage released a report with some intermediate targets in 2020 that we would have 500,000 new HIV infections. We would have brought AIDS-related deaths down to about 500,000 as well. And when we look at what was happening in 2010 and the number of deaths, and then to make sure that 90% of the people who have HIV know their status, and of those 90% initiated on ARV treatment and 90% are virally suppressed. And that would have 2 benefits. The one, the individual survival benefits, and 2 is the prevention of onward transmission of HIV infection. So when we look at the data in 2022, of course, when these 2020 targets were set, none of us knew that we would be spending the past 3 years in the midst of COVID-19. Notwithstanding, there were several things that came together to ensure that we have now increased the number of people living with HIV. We have 39 million people living with HIV as a result of triple therapy, as a result of treatment access, and are now living healthy lives, contributing to society, contributing to the economy. In terms of deaths, we had 630,000 people dying from AIDS-related illnesses in the past, in 2022. And we had 1.3 million new HIV infections. So remember I said 500,000 new infections, so we're about 2.5-fold more than that. That translates to about 3,500 infections taking place each day, even as we sit here and meet and discuss. About half of those infections and half the people living with HIV are in sub-Saharan Africa. And of those, 63% of those infections are taking place in adolescent girls and young women between the ages of 15 to 24 years. And the country I come from, South Africa, has the highest burden of infection. 1 in 5 infections taking place globally is in South Africa. And when the MP spoke, earlier today, and he was saying in 2006, he was at the Toyota factory. That Toyota factory is in the same city that I live in, where I was born, where I grew up. And we've lived through that experience of seeing people dying, many people dying during the period 2000 to about 2008-9. And with treatment access, that picture has changed completely. We no longer see these 20, 30, 40 deaths a day, and we are seeing people living. But our challenge is the high rates of new infections that we continue to see in young women. They are getting infected from men who are 25 and above, who are in turn getting infected from women who are over 25. And it is the cycle of transmission, young women acquiring from men, men over 25 having relationships with women over 25 and under 25, that despite high prevalence of HIV, we continue to see high rates of new HIV infections.
Thank you. I think it is really important to note that AIDS is not over yet. And of course, the new infection is even occurring as we speak right now. And it really breaks my heart if it is girls and adolescent young girls, young women who are infected simply because she doesn't know how to prevent. You have made, your Caprisa has made a significant progress in the medical technology with tenofovir gel and expanded PrEP, that's pre-exposure prophylaxis. Do you feel, what is your view of new infections still occurring after all these advancement of prevention technology is happening?
So I think, Dr. Seko, that's a great question. I want to just go back a step. And I think when we were talking about inheritance just now, I was reminded in 1988, I was doing my master's in public health at Columbia University, and having lived through New York in that time, and seeing the different phases of HIV in Africa, in the US, in New York City, depending on whether you're in the East Side or whether you're in the Harlem or in the Bronx. And we have globally made so much progress from then. You know, then we barely knew the cause of HIV. We barely had diagnostic tests. You had to wait 2 weeks before you got a result. And returning to South Africa, it was quite stunning. You know, this is pre-democracy in South Africa, and we had no data about HIV. And one of the first studies that Slim and I, my husband and I, undertook was to try and quantify the HIV epidemic. And we did this population-based survey, one of the early ones in Africa. And what we established in this population-based survey that included about 6,000 people was HIV in South Africa was at a very early stage. The prevalence was less than 1%. In other words, less than 1 in 100 people were infected with HIV. But what was striking was that 4 times more infection in women compared to men. And then we're trying to, why is it, I mean, if it's sexually transmitted, why is it more common in women compared to men. We found also that women were getting infected 5 to 7 years earlier than men. And I'm giving you the story and the backstory to this. We started off 35 years ago not to find women-initiated technologies, but the epidemiological data analyzed by age and sex told us that what was driving infection was this age-sex disparate relationships. And then we have to go and ask the woman, what is going on? And we ask the men too, the same question. And what we learned was that the whole world was focused in preventing infection amongst men who have sex with men. And there you had abstinence, you had behavior change, you had condoms. But here are women telling us, we understand where our risk is. And there isn't a single thing here that we ourselves can use to prevent HIV infection. And at that stage, you know, we didn't realize that there wasn't the word like co-knowledge creation, but it was these interviews with the women from urban, rural, peri-urban areas, young women, older women, who are telling us, we know how HIV is spread, but we have many challenges in trying to get our partner to use a condom, in even exercising our right to remain uninfected and demand, no, we can't, no sex or whatever. So it was a basic human right violation that was playing out in front of us in terms of women and their vulnerability, in addition to young women. And so that's when we started our quest to find a woman-initiated technology. We didn't know 18 years later we'd get the first sort of glimpse and glimmer of hope when we, in 2010, demonstrated the proof of concept that the use of tenofovir topically in uninfected women can prevent HIV infection. And that was a very exciting time because globally, we had many trials. And in fact, most of us working in HIV were met with failure after failure. And in the prevention space, we were known as the experts in failure because at that stage already we had triple therapy to treat patients with AIDS. We had a number of interventions to prevent infected mothers in terms of transmission to babies, but we didn't have anything to prevent infection in women. And so PrEP, then a whole space opened, and we started to see, as with any discovery, a lot of innovation taking place. And so we started to see other products coming along, and right now we have monthly rings for women over 18. We have a 2-monthly injection that many African countries participated in, but we're still waiting for access to that intervention. And then there's a whole lot of studies that are in the field or being evaluated right now, potentially an annual implant, potentially a 6-monthly injection with a new antiretroviral called capsid inhibitor, and potentially broadly neutralizing antibodies that in combination. So it looks like a very busy landscape. And what we need to ensure is that these discoveries don't sit on the shelf. They're not there in peer-reviewed publications, but they get to reach the people who need to benefit most. So it took us nearly a decade for the daily oral tablets of tenofovir, also commonly called PrEP, to be widely available globally. And we have, for some people, it's a perfectly fine option. It's like contraceptives. You have choice. And for some people, uptake, adherence, perception of risk, all come together in terms of preventing uptake of PrEP. The other part I want to briefly flag is, you know, when we did the first proof of concept, we were surprised that we had an antiretroviral agent, which is very HIV specific, but we only had a very modest 39% protection. And so we wondered and asked why. And when you have a partially effective trial, you're able to go back and answer a whole lot of questions. And one of the things that we found was that for women, you need a very high threshold of the drug. And just to give you an example, that if men take 2 to 3 of the 7 tablets in a week, it would be like they took 7 out of the 7 tablets. They took a tablet every day. In contrast, when you look at women, if they miss 1 tablet, in other words, they take 6 out of the 7 tablets, it's like they took 0 tablets. And so the amount of drug women need to have to benefit from oral tenofovir is much higher than what we need in men. So here again, even though we have a promising technology, and so our team and others have been studying the vaginal microbiome and trying to understand why this high level. And what we found was that women who have what's called vaginal dysbiosis, so the genital environment is altered, the pH is changed, then what we have is normal bacteria that exist become pathogenic. And then we have a competition for phosphates, and then that's one of the reasons why we have the reduced potency. So first, this vaginal environment being altered enhances HIV acquisition rates by about 3-fold, and 2, it reduces the potency of these pre-exposure prophylaxis agents that we are looking at. So I would say from a scientific point of view, it's very exciting. From an implementation point of view, from the discovery to benefiting people, it has been somewhat disappointing that we are taking so long to take these discoveries into the bedside, if you like, or into access for people who would benefit.
Thank you, Dr. Karaisha. I think the lay people like me, even though I have been living in the global AIDS responses, it is still a very scientific and it's exciting, but at the same time, I feel that we still don't understand what we need to do as a lay people. And I think in earlier your comment, you have said that you have learned so much from the discussion with the people, the discussion with the local women, discussion with the girls. What would you like to hear from those people in the communities to tell you what they need or what they want?
So community and community engagement and science communication to the public is critically important. In fact, as I started off saying in 1990 when I did the first population-based survey, testing people and seeing who's infected, who's not infected, didn't tell me as much as the interviews that I did with the range of women. And it was those interviews that gave us insight into the gap in terms of where we are. And make no mistake, this AIDS-sex disparate relationships is not just about HIV, but it is fundamentally about gender power dynamics and disparities that exist. I'm wearing my Sustainable Development Goal badge here. I'm a little bit lost with all the color on my jacket, but we have Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is about gender equity. And if we pause for a minute and say, here we are in the 21st century, and we're facing many existential threats. It's not a time for us to have the luxury to say that we can exclude half the world, and half the world cannot be part of making the decisions, of their voices not being heard. And that is something in HIV that we get reminded about, that in the development arena, we have done so much and we've made so much progress in bridging gaps between infants who are born, whether you're a boy or a girl, for the first 5 years of their life, for the first 10 years of their life. But at onset of secondary sexual development, and this is adolescence, we suddenly see this divergence that we used to see that contributed to infant mortality rates. And in the Millennium Development Goals, we had one indicator around maternal deaths. And maternal deaths are an extreme measure of how well societies are doing. And while we could tick the box that we did progress in this area, we did progress on that area, on maternal deaths we didn't. And one of the root causes of that is we have children having children. We have children who are not getting adequate information about comprehensive sexuality education. We have children not knowing what their sexual reproductive health rights are. And earlier we were hearing about how gay men were discriminated against. In a similar way, we live in societies that determine when people should learn about sex and sexuality and their rights and access to information. So when you have a older man, 25, and older, grooming a young girl, and that leads to her having sex, having unprotected sex, you have teen pregnancies, you have what that means is she drops out of school and she's caught up in a vicious cycle of dependency. Her opportunity to get a good job is curtailed. And so her life trajectory is very different. So if we don't fix this problem of adolescent girls and young women, and that doesn't mean preventing HIV in this group, as I said, describe the cycle of transmission, also means about men taking responsibility. And I want to share with you, you were asking about community engagement. And whenever we find new things others have discovered, we share that with the communities we work with. We do that through radio interviews, TV interviews, and actually going into communities that have a high burden of infection. And there's an informedness that's coming in, more decisions. And quite often when I share the statistics I share with you, which is by age 20, 1 in 10 girls are infected with HIV. By age 25, it's every other woman. And by age 30, we're talking about 70% of women infected with HIV in these hyper-endemic epidemic settings. People look at me and say, I didn't know that. And I say, well, now that you know, what are you going to do about it? Because I can tell you, I have 2 daughters. If my any one of them, and I have a son, if my son arrived home with a woman who is old enough to be his daughter, or my children are with someone who's old enough to be their father, they would be shown the door before you could say anything. So it is also, what do we do? What are the norms? And when we observe these things happening, how do we react? So community is absolutely central. They know what is going on, particularly in communities where there's a lot of stigma and discrimination for a whole lot of reasons. Maybe it's around sexual orientation. Maybe it's around drug use. Maybe it's around young people having sex. Then there have been NGOs, CSOs, non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations who've been able to know this and talk about this. And so that peer support has been so critically important when you have highly stigmatized conditions and situations. And all I can say is we have to do more and more of that. In fact, the theme for World AIDS Day is communities leading. Our success in HIV has been because of activists challenging scientists, activists demanding access to treatment. And that all came together 20 years ago when we really saw what global solidarity meant with the establishment of the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, Malaria, PEPFAR, governments committing to access to life-saving treatment drugs.
Wow. I just have to say wow for the things that you have already mentioned. Going back to the women, young women, adolescent girls that I met in Africa, the first thing, it was about 2010 that I was in Zambia at the time when 1 in 4 adults were diagnosed with HIV, and a lot of deaths are happening within the communities. One widowed, luckily she was a negative status. She told me that, yes, I'm still alive, I'm negative, but I don't have the means to earn money, so that I am going to put myself to the danger of HIV infection again, because that's the only way that I will be supported by the male counterpart in the community or in the place. So fundamentally, I was thinking that it is a gender issue that we also need to tackle as a part of the AIDS response or the HIV prevention package. And when you say that we have the technology now to prevent by ourselves, but women are still fearing to be found with those pills that they are taking or other means of protections, only because it shows that she is not believing in the negative status of her partner, male partner. So being a female scientist, how are you seeing the gender issues that is more fundamental gender issues, power imbalance included? How are they going to, or how had they been influencing your research? I would really love to hear your story by yourself.
So firstly, I go back to my survey and I say, most often when you hear an epidemic quantified, even in COVID, right? You hear, here's the number of cases. You don't see that cases often, nowadays we may see it geospatially. Here's so many infections here, so many infections here. But we don't say how many more women infected, how many more men infected, how many young people infected, how many older people infected. So I think this is one of the perspectives that when we look at society more inclusively, then we look in a more granular way around where those infections are, who is getting infected, how they are getting infected. These interviews, typically you would say, well, here's somebody who's, here's the problem, let's find a solution. And this idea of engaging those who are most vulnerable in identifying what the issues are was very important. The other point I want to make is that for me, the biomedical interventions were only the first step, that at least it would ensure enough young women would survive HIV-free and be able to take on those root causes of gender-powered disparities. And that I don't see it as an end in itself. So firstly, you have the biomedical intervention, the other is access to those interventions. And that this period of around 15 to 24 years, some 8 or 9 years, it's a time where some of us can actually remember that it's a sort of rite of passage. It's a time in our lives where we experiment. We want to try things. We want to do things to establish who we are, what we want to do. And for young women in Africa, they're being deprived of this very important period in their lives because of the threat of HIV. So this issue around how do we address gender, I think in an organization like CAPRISA, where more than 90% of the staff are women, from leadership all the way down, has been an important role model for involving other women, for other women to pursue careers in science, for other women to be engaged in finding solutions. So I think that's important, because when you're trying to find out who you are and you want to make a contribution to society that's impactful, that you want to change things, then you need to see people who look like you. And whatever it is, and that diversity and inclusivity is very important. And that's one of the things that has gone. But I do think that as we think about young women, it's not simply about what we do for young women. We have to shift gender norms. And we can't have a situation where men can do whatever they want to do, when they want to do it, and how they want to do it. And all we're doing is trying to put more responsibilities on young women and women, that we do need to start talking about responsibilities across the board, across different age ranges. And we need to be creating a supportive culture and space where everyone is safe, and everyone is safe to reach their full potential in life.
That's, yeah, I can only agree with you on that. But at the same time, I'm reminded all the time, seeing my young students, a lot of them female, that young women or adolescent girls, they're not homogeneous either. There is so much of the variety of who they are, and intersectionality of young women with the other risk factors also have the space for HIV to come and infect you. How would you say that us as individual can think about what is happening to women, young women in Africa, as an individual Japanese, most of us female, a little bit older than being young, and what can we understand? What can we do? What can we think about them with their own intersectionality and everything included? It's a lot of diversities that we have to take it into our consideration. Is there anything that you can talk to us?
So, I look at us and I see one humanity, I see one earth, and I see us as one people. And yet we look different, we speak differently, and I think that's the beauty of being a human being, is our diversity. And I think that I want to go back to a point I made earlier, which is that the problem of HIV in Japan is of a smaller magnitude than what we see in Africa. And that when the Japanese government and the Japanese people make a commitment to contribute to the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria, the message that I'm getting is that you care as much about the fate and people in Africa as do you. You understand that we are interconnected and we have a shared vulnerability. During COVID, the Director General of WHO said, "No one is safe until everyone is safe." And I'm reminded in HIV, for example, the preceding epidemic that we had was TB. And when HIV came along, we turned our attention to HIV. And what did we see? We saw that 70% of people in Africa who have HIV, with advancing HIV disease, the most common opportunistic infection was TB. And because we are neglecting TB, we saw the emergence of multi-drug resistant TB and extremely drug-resistant TB. And that's just one example. TB is spread by an aerosol. So it's not like HIV, which is largely sexually transmitted. So neglecting TB meant that something we thought was only in developing countries suddenly became a new threat for everyone around the world, and reminded us that we can't forget things and leave things half complete. And that as we think, we have to also build. What we saw was our 40-year investments in HIV created infrastructure, technology, therapeutics, diagnostics that enabled us, when faced with the new pandemic of COVID-19, to move more rapidly. And you saw how South Africa contributed to identifying new variants of concern, of setting up those diagnostic tests and so on. So it is that care that whether we in Japan or we anywhere in the world, if we take an approach, this is not my problem, it's somebody else's problem, then one day it becomes your problem. But I think if we look at it more like we all one people, and that we have so many challenges and threats, that when we can come together to find solutions, when we come together with a single-minded focus to change that, we can do it. We've seen that with treatment, and we will continue to see that. So I would say to people in Japan that we appreciate your solidarity, we appreciate your commitment, and we appreciate that you care about people all over the world, including in Africa.
Thank you. And I think it is a very good reminder for all of us here who are likely to watch this wonderful act coming up. But HIV is not only the issue of gay men in New York or gay men in Tokyo, but also the HIV is still actively influencing the lives of lots of people around the world. And that may start the new pandemic sometimes or else. Is that something that I could conclude with?
So I think that is a very nice way to end, Dr. Seko, that we are living in an era of many challenges, and some of us felt maybe a little bit distant from HIV. It was a problem here, there, not near us. But COVID showed us, no, we are all vulnerable, and we're living in this era where we're likely to see more pandemics, and we will face more challenges. And I hope the lesson we take away from HIV and COVID is that of global solidarity, that when we work together, we will survive, we will do better, we will thrive, and we will reach greater heights. But when I look at these adolescent girls and young women, the delay in access to treatment meant that we have many parents who died and many orphans in Africa, and that we're still seeing that disproportionate population pyramid, where 65% of the population in Africa is under the age of 35. And that many young people are growing up without adult parental guidance. And when I think about how important grandparents are, how important parents are, and I see this in Japan, for example, of how grandparents are supporting their grandchildren and their children, we don't have that continuity. And I'm reminded of inheritance. It's 30 years, 40 years, 3 generations, and a good reminder that this is about continuity. This is what legacy of humanity is, when we can give a story, and a story that we can be proud of from generation to generation, and we can ensure that continues. And so I'm very excited about inheritance, Shwenya. I'm only feeling sorry that I'm not going to be here when the play is launched, but I do hope that it reminds us about not just the knowledge that we can share between generations, but that's a universal story that we can all enjoy and celebrate as human beings. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So for now, I think we should open the floor for questions, because I'm quite sure, I shouldn't be the only one privileging from your wisdoms. 会場の皆さん、大変難しい話だったとは思うんですけれども、こんなに世界でも有名な HIV エイズの疫学者がいらっしゃる機会というのもあまりないと思いますので、もしご質問などあられましたら、そのマイクの方に、来ていただけますと質問を受けることができるんですが、どうぞお近くのマイクからご質問ください。
日本語で失礼します。南アフリカの現状、アフリカの現状をお聞きしたんですけれども、日本でもそうなんですが、 継承という意味ではとても学校教育がとても大切だと思います。実は先日ある大学で私講演しましてエイズの話をしたところ、エイズに関しては80年代の文化的もしくは社会的チェンジ変革ではなくて、ただ単にどうやったらエイズ HIV の感染を防げるかというテクニカルなそういう話のみに限られていて、その日本の教育というものがそのエイズによる社会もしくは文化の違い文化の変革というものに関して全く触れずに表面的な予防の教育でしかなかった。でも実際先ほどおっしゃったようにジェンダーの問題であるとかセクシュアリティの問題であるとか、そういうものというのは本当は実はとても大切なエイズが社会に及ぼしたものだと思うんですけれども、その辺を含めてアフリカの学校教育とかそういうところでは一体どういうような具体的な伝承が行われているのか、継承が行われているのか、もしお知りでしたら知りたいと思います。
So unfortunately, I'm going to have to answer in English. So we have some kind of education going on in terms of information, but we constantly have this tension between who's paying for this and it being done. So with some donors, there's restrictions, and then even within the country, some people's voices are stronger, and those who have very strong beliefs about morals and what people should know and shouldn't know. So while we would like, many of us would like comprehensive sexuality education that starts very early and is age appropriate as they progress, as we talk about nutrition, as we talk about what are the values in society, and the general guidance we give to children about how to live in society with respect and so on. We have very little of that going on, and it depends on where you are. And also it depends, I think, also not totally depending on schools, but I think as parents, we also have to take responsibility for the values that we share with our children. And children do what they see, not what they're told. And I think there's a lot more that can be done, and both in terms of sharing issues around sexual reproductive health rights, sexual reproductive health issues, comprehensive sexuality education. And I think we have to keep working towards that. And as parents, as aunts, uncles, as members of society, to make sure that our schools and our homes are preparing children for being adults and for the responsibilities that come with that.
Thank you very much. My name is Victor Bampo. I work for I work for UNAIDS as the head of partnerships. And thank you very much to JCIE and FG, Friends of the Global Fund Japan, for this very wonderful opportunity. And Professor, thank you. It's always inspiring hearing from you. I had a quick comment and also a question which I think you've answered in a certain way. So the comment is that I think as UNAIDS, we're working to bring the whole world together. You know about our strategy, our current strategy, talking about ending AIDS and ending inequalities. Because I think and that's about the what, what we should be looking at. And you touched on the who. So you touched on the adolescent girls and young women in this particular talk. And I just wanted us to also reflect on the fact that you had already spoken about the biomedical interventions and all the progress that we've made there. But then the area of what the strategy calls the enablers, so gender-based violence, the human rights violations, which we saw an increase of during the COVID pandemic and all those differentials in power dynamics that you so aptly described. My question is, in your experience, how has, in your country or in anywhere else that you have the experience, how have these dynamics been addressed? Because it's more difficult to address those. And I'm talking as a former Deputy Health Minister of Ghana, and I know how difficult it is for government. And you talked about comprehensive sexuality education and how some of the arguments are skewed. So in your experience, how can we bridge that gap so that the biomedical matches the enablers and then we can get to the target of 2030? Thank you.
That's a great question, Victor. And I keep repeating, it is about inequalities and how do we address inequalities. And the biomedical is just one part, and as almost it's giving us a bit of pause and space and opportunity. I at no point see it as a solution. It's just about giving people time and space to get through a particularly difficult period. So the issues, I think as we talk about ending AIDS, some of us also talk about the last mile. And we've made a lot of progress in many countries, including in Africa. But in Eastern and Southern Africa, we still see communities and districts where there's a very high burden of HIV infection. And for people who, like myself, involved in epidemics, we think about this last mile as what got us here is not going to get us there. And I think we've reached that critical milestone in our response to HIV, that we've done all the things we can do, and many of those require strong health delivery systems, and we've strengthened that, we've enabled it, and those who come to healthcare services can benefit from a lot of our investments. But in this last mile, we have to do things differently, and I'm reminded of meeting Bill Fahey, who was head of CDC and who was part of leading the efforts to contribute to smallpox eradication. And that's where, this idea that when you're at the last mile and you want to put out those fires that are there, you have to take a totally different approach. And in the smallpox eradication, it ended up that there was a team going to those remaining countries that had not eradicated, and they went literally community by community. And before this mobile team arrived, they would reach out to community leaders, to faith-based leaders, and there would be preparation for the smallpox eradication team arriving. And so when they arrived, everyone was ready. And that was that literally community by community that you had to work and go. And so I think about HIV as where are the high burden districts? Where are those infections taking place? And we have a pretty good idea with the geospatial mapping we do of new infections to know where those are. So it can't be more of the same, but rather more drawing on our knowledge, on our knowledge of where those infections are, what is driving those infections, and then looking at what do we have available and what's the appropriate combination of things we need to pull together in order to address and break chains of transmission. And that is not going to be the same thing community by community, country by country. And I think often when we think about solving problems, we want a silver bullet, we want a vaccine, we want a cure. And unfortunately, with the diversity of contributions and contributors to the spread of HIV, we have to look at what is those bespoke interventions we need to do. And I believe it's those that, and that shift in mindset that will take us, and it may actually turn out to be more expensive than this first 70, 80%, or however much success that we've had. So we've got to find that, we've got to define it, And we've got to address it in a very localized way, drawing on our global experiences that we have.
Thank you very
And
much.
I should say, I don't have all the answers, but that's my opinion and perspective. Thank you.
他の皆様いかがでしょうか。どうぞ。
皆さんこんにちは。UNAIDS の川原林香織でございます。I will ask the question in English. My name is Kaori Kawarabayashi. I work for UNAIDS with my boss here, Victor. If you can allow another question from UNAIDS. One thing that we are looking at now is really the sustainability of the HIV response. It's excellent to see all of the support coming from international organizations, from donors such as the government of Japan, the work that the Global Fund is doing, and the work that UNAIDS is doing. But we need to be looking at what is the sustainability of the response. We cannot always be supporting continuously. We need to make sure that there's national ownership, there's community ownership, there's domestic resources being mobilized in a lot of these countries, including sub-Saharan Africa. As you are promoting the biomedical, even the AGYW, the gender and human rights aspects, stigma and discrimination, and all the various aspects, how are you also promoting the fact that we need to be looking at sustainability? This issue is not yet going away. We hope it will eventually, but to make sure that we have the sustainability of the HIV response, the political, the community ownership, the national ownership, domestic resource mobilization. Is that something that is also on your agenda that you are promoting as you go around doing your wonderful talks and giving us a lot of really important information? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. I used to run a training program for 22 years that was building science capacity in Southern Africa for HIV and TB. And it's a question I asked myself repeatedly. How long do you run a training program before it becomes self-sustaining? And so personally, I don't believe that one should keep investing and going on, that there's a point where you have to say, how does this become self-sustaining? And in the context of the HIV response, so I can advise, but the decision makers are really governments and other key stakeholders. And I'm not saying it to put responsibility and blame elsewhere, but I think in HIV, we have to be thinking about at least three things. The one is that we've initiated about 30 million people on treatment. This treatment is lifelong treatment. And even if we're able to bring the reproductive rate of new infections down, which we nowhere near, even with the 3 zeros being achieved in 2030, we're going to need a vaccine and a cure to talk about eradication and elimination. So that's the first, that we have to sustain those on treatment and ensure that they aren't breaks in treatment interruptions so that we don't end up with drug-resistant strains of HIV infection, and that we don't drop the ball on investments already made, because it would be very silly to reverse the gains. But we also need to be thinking about the remaining challenges, and we have to be thinking that the global solidarity efforts have been important to catalyze us to get to this point, and that countries that we work in, where life expectancy had dropped to under 40 years, are now, it's not just about saving lives, but it's about saving lives that change society. And that's where many of these countries are getting to, where you're starting to see adults, children growing up to be adults, and that decimation of adults have been changed. So that resource within society is being restored. And it's not just about breathing, but it's about how do you contribute to society. So I think that is the investment, is not just in saving lives, but whose lives have been saved, and what are individuals now positively living with HIV doing, and how are they changing society? many of our governments make decisions based on taxpayers' money, and those decisions are not always the smartest decisions, and they're not always the smartest priority. So I think civil society and active civil society engagement and involvement in terms of how priorities are set are important, and it is that together that will push governments to make right decisions about priority setting. And I don't see Africa certainly as a big begging bowl, because I think what we've seen is the face of Africa changing. We're seeing that demographic dividend of young people paying returns. We are seeing how opportunities created is actually transforming things. So I think even in our mindsets, it's partnerships and collaborations that have enabled that. And ongoing partnerships and collaborations would also help transition into the self-sufficient space. And so when we think about issues of inequalities and injustices, they don't happen overnight. And I can talk as an epidemiologist, but I think it takes, even in the scientific space, a whole lot of people to really understand how social movements are created and how social movements bring change. And I think as we've witnessed that civil society is not disempowered. Civil society has power, and we're seeing it occasionally. We saw it with AIDS and treatment access, and we need the voice of civil society to be much stronger in terms of who defines and determines priorities and how limited resources are used, so that we have an important legacy to leave for the future and also address current challenges.
So time is running out, but I think we have heard so much from the wisdom of Professor and Dr. Kalaisha. Thank you very much for your talk, and I hope we will be able to bring this knowledge and some shared experiences home to take HIV/AIDS issues at our own mind and then to action. The communities supporting and communities moving around with the AIDS epidemic had changed another pandemic, or how the other diseases are being responded. That is very obvious in a way that the Global Fund has been supporting many countries in the South. So let's give the hands for Dr. Kalaisha, and then let me end the session here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a real honor and privilege to be here with you, Dr. Seiko, and thank you very much.
皆様ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。以上をもちましてスペシャルセッションアフリカのエイズとジェンダー終了とさせていただきます。